Hey, Jeannie.
Hey, Brew.
Who's our guest on the Energy Nerd Show today?
Today we have Iain.
Oh, Iain.
Yeah, Iain Addleton from Synapse. Hey, Iain, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Nice to see you again, Bruce and Jeannie.
Great to see
Good
you.
to see you too.
What are you talking about today?
Today, we're talking about a report that Synapse did back in November 2021 on coal unit uneconomic commitment in Georgia Power's service territory.
What happened there?
Well, it's similar to a lot of reports we do where we look at how coal units are committed and dispatched by vertically integrated utilities. So we looked at about 4 years of public data for Georgia Power and looked at 5 of their coal plants just to see whether that was the economic resource choice by the utility. And we found that, in fact, they were not the most economic resource that the utility could have called upon. And over that 4-year period, we estimated that it cost ratepayers for Georgia Power about $232 million. And as we'll talk about, the actual figure might be a bit higher. And that's kind of our headline finding, though, is that the way these coal plants are operated does end up costing captive ratepayers who don't really have any choice quite a lot of money as the years go by.
And people actually paid that?
It's in their electric bill, and it's quite hidden, and it's a very technical issue, but it certainly adds up over time. I have a few charts and figures to show. I'll start with the first one, and they kind of build up to the major takeaway. So the first figure shows our estimate of the average annual production cost at each of the 5 units we looked at, and compared that to what's called the system lambda. So a system lambda is a kind of a proxy for the energy market price. It's basically the marginal cost of production on Southern Company and Georgia Power's system. And so if for any reason the megawatts provided by these coal plants were replaced, that's kind of what we would expect the replacement megawatt hour to cost. And so this first chart shows that the coal plants we looked at are generally significantly higher than what an alternative resource would be on the marketplace. And maybe a point in favor of our analysis is that the highest 2 lines, McIntosh and Hammond, actually did retire. You can see those lines retire in 2019. Our analysis did identify those as the most expensive coal plants in Georgia Power's fleet, and they did end up retiring. But there's still 3 other plants that we've been looking at, and you can see that through 2020, they remained quite a lot higher than the system lambda, or the kind of alternative cost of energy, had these coal plants not been generating.
But Iain, aren't you focused on all the months? What about January 2018, when these coal plants, or most of them, were economic to run briefly?
Yeah, you'll notice, as you pointed out, there's a huge spike in the system lambda in January 2018. That was caused by some extreme winter weather as part of a bomb cyclone, where the price of energy more than tripled due to frozen pipelines, disrupted services at refineries, and a higher demand as well because of the cold weather. So we'll see this in future charts. For a very short period, running these plants actually did make sense, and they made a lot of money. But one of the reasons that we look at a long time frame is we want to see over time what the impact of uneconomic unit commitment is. And so despite that short 2 or 3 week period, over the whole entire period, the losses really added up from these units.
I know we're mainly talking about costs and prices here, but when I look at that, I think of all the people who are just mainly concerned about reliability. Is there any tie here? Would there be any reliability issues if you keep closing these plants?
So reliability is extremely important, and pretty much every utility operates along the lines of reliability, affordability, and over time, increasingly decarbonization as well. And each of those are as important as the others. There's generally specific proceedings for forecasting energy demand in the future and understanding whether there's enough resources on the system to meet reliability needs. So we're involved in a lot of those dockets. They're called integrated resource planning dockets, and Georgia Power is going through their 2022 IRP currently, and we are involved in that proceeding. And so there is generally a different setting for determining whether these units are needed on Georgia Power's system for reliability needs. I will say that since we published this report, Georgia Power has announced a number of retirement dates for these coal plants. Between 2022 and 2035, all of these plants are slated to retire. Wansley first, in 2022. Shear, I think, is supposed to be fully retired by 2028. And actually one of the units has an earlier retirement date that's owned by a different utility. And then Bowen is slated to go until 2035, but also has an announced retirement date. And those retirement dates do have, reliability baked into determining those dates. And we'll see how the IRP proceeding goes to see if there's cases where they might even be retired earlier. I'm just going to clarify, all of this does use public data. So it uses a combination of FERC Form 1 for actual fuel costs, FERC 714 for system lambda, and then FERC 923 and EPA CAMD data for annual and hourly generation data. So all of this is based on public data, which I think is very important for bringing these issues to light. So we'll move on to figure 2. And this is a zoomed in view of a single week during our 4-year study period. It is in fact the week where the coal fleet lost the most amount of money in a 7-day period. So there's 2 parts to this graph. The part above 0 is the generation from Wansley, Shearer, and Bowen. And it shows that these plants operated continuously over this 7-day period. The generation never went to 0. They were always on, and at times they were dispatched a little bit higher. But the real important line is the red line, which shows the hourly value versus the hourly excess cost of running these units. So when these units were economic, when they were cheaper to run than the system lambda or the energy price at the time, that red line should be above 0. And when these units are too expensive or more expensive than other units, the red line is below 0. And you'll see that almost the entire time these plants were running, with the exception of actually a single hour, these plants were losing money for ratepayers. And it's important to look at it over a 7-day time frame, because there are very limited times where it might be appropriate to run a plant, even if it's losing money. But that becomes less and less likely as the time frame you look at gets bigger. So the fact that these plants were running so continuously and losing money hour after hour after hour really shows the direction of this problem and why we think there's an issue with how Georgia Power runs their coal fleet. If we go to the next figure, this shows the cumulative losses and how they build up over time. So these aren't the monthly losses, but it's cumulative. So every month's losses are added on. And if there's a month where they provide value, that's also added on. So this chart shows that month after month after month, these plants were operated in a way that lost money. As Bruce rightly pointed out, there is a spike in January 2018 with winter weather causing very high electricity prices. That for a brief moment actually brought these plants into a place where they were providing value. But again, that vanished pretty quickly. And by the end of 2018, these plants were back to losing money in a way that built up over time. And that's how we arrived at our $232 million in estimated losses or estimated excess costs during this period. And the next figure actually shows what happens if you exclude January 2018. And this is more illustrative. We don't want to, exclude a month kind of haphazardly, but that was only a 2-week period where those plants switched from being uneconomic to a brief period where they were economic. And if you take that out, actually the losses are much, much higher over time. We actually saw, if you take out that month, January 2018, the losses from these 5 plants would have been in excess of $434 million over that 4-year period.
Is this stuff that you're sharing on the stand, or someone from Synapse is getting the message across loud and clear somewhere?
I'm not the person at Synapse that shares this on the stand, but there are a number of expert witnesses at Synapse that do that. I'll make a crossover shout out to an earlier episode of the Energy Nerd Show in which Devi Glick is one of our main expert witnesses in this area. She did her own episode a couple years ago. And so she has been a big part of this practice at Synapse. We've worked very closely with the Sierra Club over the last few years in many different jurisdictions to explore this issue and hopefully make it more public and bring it in front of commissions. And there's also a growing body of literature around this issue as well. Sierra Club released a report in 2019 called Playing with Other People's Money that really explored this issue on a national level. The Union of Concerned Scientists released a similar report in 2020, and then a number of independent market monitors have also increasingly started to write about this issue and make it public. And there's a few different jurisdictions that have actually opened dedicated and investigative dockets to explore this issue in particular areas. I'm thinking of Minnesota, Michigan, and I think Indiana as well, all have investigative dockets to look at this issue in more detail. So it's definitely emerging as an issue that commissions have more awareness of. And there's people at Synapse that definitely talk about this on the stand in front of utilities and commissions quite regularly.
So that's really great. A lot of times people ask me, where do you find hope, or, how do you not get down? And I feel like this is the type of message that is getting more and more widely shared, and these coal plants are actually getting shut down.
Also, just by operating them smarter, we could save money and reduce air emissions, including CO2. Seems like an easy win-win, right?
That's the big impact. It would definitely save ratepayers money. Some of our recommendations include opening a investigative docket for Georgia Power specifically. There's other options that are called seasonal coal operations, or it's sometimes called a coal holiday, where you don't operate the coal plants for big chunks of the year. So that's another option. Announced retirement dates are also very important, because one of the biggest incentives for a utility to use them when they're uneconomic is to prove that they should still be on the system. When in fact they actually might not be worth keeping around. Not at the risk of damaging reliability at all. They just show that they continue operating in a way that keeps them on longer than they have to. And so that costs ratepayers money. And as Bruce said, it also ends up causing a lot more emissions. And I think in the last episode with Debbie, Bruce said that, we look around for a way of pricing carbon and putting a price on these emissions. And this is a way of reducing emissions while saving money, which is a very important thing to find in a very important and complicated issue regarding decarbonization. I think one of the most important things to say is that we used public data to develop this, and there's simplifying assumptions you use when you use public data. For example, an average annual cost of production might not necessarily be the best way of capturing this. Our analysis was at the hourly level, because we had hourly generation information and hourly system lambda information. But our production cost estimates were more of an average across the entire year. And one of the great things that comes out of an investigative docket is that there's a chance for discovery. You can ask the utility to provide information, their own projections on a daily or weekly basis around how they're going to use their resources. And you can get a lot more clarity and transparency around the data that we tried to find in the public forum. And so that's very important for getting a better handle on this issue. I think we clearly identified the direction of the problem, and that is a problem. But an investigative docket where you can try and make things public that were previously confidential, or you can just look at the data on a more granular level as provided by the utility, I think is very important for even getting closer at the true scale of this problem.
Right, and to kind of understand what's the company's strategy. They sure seem to be losing money on every ton of coal burned, every megawatt hour made. Most of them are losing money. So what kind of either hidden brilliant strategy or boneheaded, corrupt strategy is going on, right? To kind of open the hood and look underneath and really understand what's going on.
And I'll maybe correct one thing in that question, is that it's not the companies losing money, it's ratepayers losing money. So one of the most important things that Debbie talked about on her Energy Nerd Show episode was the difference between how merchant coal plants operate and how utility-owned coal plants operate. And merchant coal plants do not have ratepayers to subsidize their losses. So they do not operate this way, actually. Debbie and the Sierra Club in that episode found that merchant coal plants are not operated uneconomically to nearly this extent just because they can't rely on ratepayers to cover their losses. By contrast, in Georgia Power's situation, if they lose money, generally those costs end up being covered by ratepayers. No matter how they come about, no matter the scale of the cost, they're just covered by captive ratepayers in individual electric bills that get sent out every month. So that kind of obscures the problem and allows companies to keep doing that, because they don't really have an incentive to stop, because they are not the ones losing money. It's ratepayers who are losing money. And this is quite a hidden technical issue that you can't really decipher from reading your electric bill every month. But these losses are baked into electric bills every month. And I think that's an important thing to note. The incentive is not for companies to necessarily stop this as things stand.
These coal plants are owned by regulated monopoly utility companies. And if they were instead owned by kind of a regular, kind of a normal profit maximizing corporation, then the operating strategy would likely be different. And they may have retired them already. I mean, like to wait for years of uneconomic operation and then retire the plant, seems very slow to recognize that there's a problem and a need to retire an asset.
Yeah, there'd be a much more of an incentive to retire or limit operations at these units if they were merchant owned, simply because as they become uneconomic, there's less and less reasons to actually use them, to an extent where an owner who is not a monopoly utility might just decide that it's not worth paying the upkeep and continuing to keep them around. And that's not the case for Georgia Power.
Well, I'm so glad you're doing this work. It seems like not just Georgia needs you. It's heartening to hear that there are changes coming.
There's lots of people at Synapse that spend a lot of time on this. And, we work with the Sierra Club mainly on this as well. But there's a growing body of work around this issue that I hope has an impact.
Thanks, Iain.
Thank you so much. It was great to see you guys again. Have a great week.
You
Thanks,
too.
you
Bye.
too.
Bye.